It's a very false ideology to think that America has succeeded purely on the basis of market forces. By now, everyone should hopefully be familiar with this notion of the innovation state, right? The fact is that Silicon Valley is not an accident, right? There's some I write about this in the book. There's this sort of, mythology that, oh, well, we just happen to have Stanford and sunny weather and therefore, poof, Silicon Valley emerges, right? It's like, hello, have you ever heard of, Department of Defense?
Sure, yeah.
There's been so much government funding and support for some of the key innovative entities, Manhattan Project style stuff that has actually been the driver of American innovation. So you can't actually pretend that it's purely a market exercise.
Welcome to Think Bigger, Think Better, where we explore how you can apply insights from visionary leaders and the most provocative philosophers and scientists of our time to make your life and our world a better place. Here's your host, author and speaker, Paul Gibbons.
Welcome back to the second episode of Think Bigger, Think Better. In our first episode, we talked to Jeremy Suri, a historian who's made an in-depth study of the presidency and what today's U.S. presidents can learn from those great presidents from bygone days. Next week, we'll be talking about critical thinking with one of the world's leading experts. Today, it's democracy. Democracy is the worst form of government, except from all those that have been previously tried. Winston Churchill said that a very long time ago. What did he mean? Why isn't democracy perfect? The end of history, the destination political system to which all non-democracies should aspire. Well, present-day democratic systems are descended from the British, American, and French radical experiments, who were truly radical experiments in the 17th and 18th century. There are several problems with it. We haven't solved these problems yet. First of all, people aren't experts, and neither are the people they elect. They aren't scientists, economists, education or social policy experts, tax specialists, environmental or energy experts. We see problems with this acutely in the United States right now, with education policy and climate policy being set by people with less knowledge than a well-informed eighth grader. Well, perhaps that's too sarcastic, but there are people certainly who could not be called experts in environmental policy or in educational policy. Secondly, related to this problem is the one of accountability. How do the people in government, by the people, put boundaries on abuse of power by those they elect? In his recent book on tyranny, Yale professor Tim Snyder reminds us that Hitler was democratically elected. He then set about dismantling the institutions that could have checked his power. And finally, third point relating to this is who counts as the people. So the fights for male suffrage were fought in England in the 17th century, in America and France in the 18th century. But women and people of color had to wait till the 20th century. Today, this battle, the suffrage battle, is fought along the fronts of voter suppression and using high-powered analytics to gerrymander districts, thus to ensure a political representative majority when you don't have a democratic demographic majority. So these problems aren't new. They were imagined by Plato 2,500 years ago and are among the reasons he thought democracy was a degenerative form of government. He thought the best form of government was by experts, aristos in the original Greek, from where we get the word aristocracy. It means something different. In his day, aristocracy weren't people with inherited wealth. They were people who were the high experts, the scientists and engineers, shall we say, of today. So many, many clever people put their minds to studying democracy and writing about these problems. They're political scientists and they're political philosophers. And today, I'm pleased to say we have one of the best, Parag Khanna. Parag is a global strategist and a best-selling author. He's a senior fellow at the Center on Asia and Globalization at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. His latest book, and the one we're going to talk about today, is Technocracy in America, Rise of the Info State. I'm going to be giving away 3 copies of Technocracy to people who rate our podcast on iTunes. Find out how to do that at the end of the show. Parag, In 2008, Parag was named one of Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century and featured in Wired magazine's Smart List. He has a PhD from London School of Economics and a bachelor's and a master's degree from Georgetown. He speaks German, Hindi, French, Spanish, and Arabic. Born in India, Parag grew up in the UAE, New York, and Germany. He's an accomplished adventurer, and some of his lengthy journeys include driving from the Baltic, through the Balkans, across Turkey, and then the Caucasus to the Caspian Sea, and the 10,000-kilometer trek from London to Ulaanbaatar in the Mongolia Charity Rally. He's also a competitive tennis player. Parag, welcome to Think Bigger, Think Better.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me on.
You're joining us from Berlin today, so let me start with a personal question. You call Berlin home between an incredibly intense travel schedule. Why Berlin, of all the places you could live?
I guess to be fair and accurate, it's one of my homes. Singapore is actually our main home, and I'm a New Yorker. But before moving to Singapore, we lived in London. So, we've been expats, my wife and I and kids for a number of years. Berlin, though, is a special place in my heart, I have to say. I've been coming here since pretty much right when the wall came down. So we're up to 28 years now that I've been coming in and out of Berlin. I've lived here on multiple occasions. It is a very special place. I had my sort of great intellectual awakening here, to come and sit on top of the Berlin Wall right as it was being knocked down, had a very significant impact on this 12-year-old at the time. And so it's kind of just shaped everything about what I've done with my life, kind of traces its way back to my parents bringing me to Berlin on a holiday to see what was left of the wall. And now I'm here with my kids and the family, and it's just it's changed so much. I've watched it change so much for over almost a 30-year period. So, no one would have thought, actually, if you think about the view of Germany in the early 1990s, was that obviously it would be quite internally consumed, given the need to orchestrate and pull off this process of reunification. Today, of course, here we are. Fast forward to the present. It's by far the most important country in Europe. It's very leading export power. Very stable economy, most stable government. People say Angela Merkel is the leader of the free world. And even though right now there is forming a new government and she's somewhat diminished in her stature, she's come down a little bit off the pedestal, it still is the most functional, well-run, large country in the world. So it's no one would have thought that, though, 25 years ago. But here we are, and it feels like you're in the middle of the action when you're back in Berlin.
Yeah, I went there briefly about 10 or 15 years ago, and I felt the history. I know that sounds like a weird thing to say, but I felt the history of the wall, the history of the Reichstag, and it's also very beautiful. I mean, it's also a very beautiful city.
By the way, what you just said may sound weird in other places, but it doesn't seem at all out of place in Berlin. You feel the history in Berlin. You really do. In fact, it still gives you goosebumps when you look down on the ground and you actually see the bronze plaques that they've laid down along the entire circumference of the wall so that you can walk it and follow it. And the tours that they gave the Checkpoint Charlie Museum, where they still have the sign in the middle of the road that says you are leaving the American sector. I mean, you can live it here still to this day.
That's pretty wild.
And it doesn't feel like, kitschy or cult or just like nostalgic and like hippie. I mean, it feels very real, but they've blended it into what has become a very modern city, save for the fact that the internet access is still very slow. Other than that, it's an ultra modern place.
Very good. Very good. Well, let's talk a little bit about democracy. Your book, Technocracy, and I think that's what my listeners are probably tuned in to listen to. You talk in the introduction to the book, Parag, about sort of degenerate forms of democracy. I'm sort of putting words in your mouth there. You don't actually use that term, but how does democracy, and I guess you specifically are interested in the United States, being from New York, how does democracy as implemented in the US, how is it failing to live up to expectations, would you say, today?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if I had used the word degenerate, but I suppose what I did use was the word degenerate, because I was referencing Plato, of course, who talks about the degeneration of government or of political systems over time. And he feared, of course, that democracy was the final last stage or penultimate stage of degeneration prior to tyranny. So I don't want to draw the parallel too far. Just because one cites Plato, it doesn't mean it's immediately relevant to the present context. I mean, after all, if we're talking about the US, remember the US is a republican form of government. It isn't a direct democracy. It isn't a multi-party parliamentary system. So it differs quite substantially from other forms of democracy. Quite frankly, no two democracies have an identical form of government. So there isn't any one gold standard. And now, of course, we'll get into that as we talk about it, the sort of thesis in more detail. But we should judge the U.S. on the U.S.'s terms, in other words. And in terms of, the performance of the democracy, as you know, the book really is much more about the performance of the state, right? It's about the health of the policy capacity of the state. One of the things in political science that we distinguish very clearly is not just the type of regime, are you a democracy or an authoritarian type of government, but the degree of government, the stateness. In other words, to what extent does the government even have the capacity to be a functional government, if you will? And it's something that we always have front and center in our minds in political science, that even if you're a democracy and you're perfect on paper and in your constitution, to what extent do you actually have the capacity to be an effective system? So this book is very, very strongly rooted in this notion of, are we an effective system? We still should be a democracy. I'm not worried that we're not going to be a democracy, but democracy alone would not be the reason that we were an effective state or society. It takes a lot of other things, a lot of other institutions, it takes a lot of good policies. It doesn't just take a regular, every 4-year reading of the sentiment and of the people through elections to be a successful state. It takes a hell of a lot more. And this book is about that hell of a lot more.
For readers, let's elaborate for them. So you say there are certain things that the government, democracy is a means of governance, and the government should provide certain things. So you talk about certain measures. One of them would be citizen engagement. One would be the levels of welfare, the levels of happiness, the levels of poverty, the levels of incarceration. You talk about certain metrics. So by what metrics do you use to judge the countries with which you compare the United States, shall we say, Switzerland and Singapore, particularly in the book?
Right. So this is where we can start to talk about comparisons, right? We shouldn't judge each other by our constitutions if we all have, certain historical circumstances that gave rise to the forms of government that we have. So Switzerland has practiced this sort of direct democracy and plebiscites and its own, cultural milieu for nearly 1,000 years. It evolved in a certain way and we evolved in a certain way. But what you can fairly compare countries on is to what extent are they delivering, the welfare that their citizens deserve. And remember, what is the purpose of government is not only to be democratically representative, but to uphold the rule of law, to protect individual rights and freedoms, to provide security, to offer certain welfare, to promote education and, civil society, all these kinds of things. It's not that government money must do these things, but the purpose of a government, if there is a actual vision of progress, is hopefully to nurture those things. So that you can measure. You can say, how good is the press freedom? What access to justice and due process do people have? What is the degree of public safety? What is life expectancy and the quality of healthcare? How widespread is literacy? These are like pretty standard, basic things that constitute a civilized society. And as you know all too well, I don't even want to rehash it, but I have been writing books about this for more than a decade. Our numbers are not looking so great compared to other, wealthy OECD countries. We're not doing very well in a number of very fundamental categories in terms of the quality of life. And that's disappointing. And you want to see that change. And it's not just going to change from the bottom up. There has to be a change in how we operate as a government, how we make rules, how we implement them, how we make our own government more efficient with the resources that it has. And, so we're not stacking up very well in that regard.
What sticks out for you? What couple of statistics stick out for you where the U.S. I'll have a lot of American listeners here that might, I was taught when I grew up in the United States that the United States was the greatest, greatest country in the world. And it may well be, but certainly certain metrics, it's certainly far, far from top. So which particularly give you pause to worry about the United States?
So
Which
it's a
metrics?
mix of things. There's sort of, thematic policy areas, and then there's institutional kinds of issues, right? So, starting with the policy arenas, I would like to see universal healthcare, right? So civilized societies have universal healthcare. That's not really something that's subject to debate, right? It just is. We're literally
Yes.
having a debate as to whether or not we want to be a civilized country by comparison. Now, if we actually settle that debate, and we don't seem to have settled that debate about whether we even want to be a civilized country in that regard, but should we decide it in the affirmative, we would still actually have to do it. And the experience of Obamacare and the insurance companies and the state versus federal mandates and the cost of providing all of this, and it seems so unbelievably complex. And as you well know, the per capita spending on healthcare in America is the highest in the world, with some very, very poor results to show for it. I'm very worried that even if we made the right philosophical decision, we're still not going to get the right outcome. Meanwhile, in civilized countries, I hate to be so self-deprecating about us, but you just don't even have this debate. I mean, they're just saying, "What the hell?" They're not even laughing at it. They used to laugh at us about this. They don't even laugh anymore. Now they just shake their heads in pity. It's just unbelievable. Then there's infrastructure, which is obviously a very big pet issue for me. Connectography, the book, was a whole kind of treatise on the importance of infrastructure, and there you can very tangibly quantify the value that the economy and that society benefits from having good roads and highways and broadband internet access, the multiplier effect that it has on the economy, the opportunity that it creates for people. Plain and simple, everyone, every citizen benefits, whether you are in Manhattan or whether you're in the Appalachian area or you're in the prairies. Your country needs good infrastructure, and there it's falling apart. Again, something I've been banging my head against the wall and writing about for such a long time. And by the way, it must be something important if both Hillary and Trump actually agreed on it, right? In fact, in the election, they were trying to outdo themselves in how much they pledged to spend on infrastructure. Hillary said 500 billion, so Trump said a trillion, right? And here we see a little bit of progress, but it's paltry compared to what we need to be doing, and it's not particularly ambitious. We're talking more about maintenance rather than like overhaul right now when it comes to infrastructure. So look, I could go on and on, but so if you just take health and infrastructure, those are thematic areas. But then, for the purposes of what we're really focusing on here, the institutional issues. Every country that ranks higher than America in the Freedom House Economist Quality of Democracy Index is a multi-party parliamentary system. And it is extremely important to us. We in America, when we look at multi-party parliamentary systems, whether it's England or Italy, we mock them. We laugh. We're like, oh, all this gridlock, ha, ha, ha. They're changing their government every 5 minutes. They're such a joke. And look at Italy. They've got Berlusconi. Like, you really want to have coalition politics. And look, I'm in Berlin right now. They haven't had a government in 2 months. But I absolutely insist that on the whole, you want to have a multi-party parliamentary system. It is a far more democratically legitimate form of government. It is not a corrupt two-party duopoly. And secondly, you have the kind of ability for parties to truly compete to represent the interests of the people rather than simply competing just to stay in power. Because you can't actually stay in power in a coalition parliamentary style form of government unless you actually have won the support of the people. The Democrats and the Republicans are only in power because you don't have any choice other than Democrats and Republicans. It's certainly not because people like them. And I think we have plenty of data and evidence to suggest that people aren't so happy. So you must absolutely have a third party, a fifth party, a fourth party, a fifth party. I don't care if it's the Greens, the Libertarians, the Natural Law Party, whoever it is, you must have multiple parties, because then nothing can be taken for granted. Absolutely nothing can be taken for granted. And I think that's a wonderful thing. That is true democracy.
There's an interesting metric. So one of the ways I think you'd want to measure the effectiveness of democracy is citizen engagement with the political processes. And on that measure, I mean, there are countries which require you to vote, which I think you think is a good idea.
Oh, I'm very explicit about it.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, even if you don't do that, I can't remember what percentage. I mean, people got very emotional about the last presidential election in the United States. I've tried to remember
Really?
voter turnout. It's well under half, though. It's 38%. Am I right about voter turnout in a
I can't
presidential election?
remember. I can't remember, but I'll tell you what. We know it was low, so the number doesn't matter, and anything less than 100 is insufficient to me.
And
It
that's
is.
good
There's
in an off
nothing.
year.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
nothing inconsistent about. It is democratic states like Australia and Belgium and a couple of others that require that have mandatory voting. So democracies can legislate mandatory voting. It's not an authoritarian act by any stretch of the imagination. It is the only way. I'm so explicit about this in the book. I say, if you want to have a proper democracy, you must have universal voting. End of story. Otherwise, you don't even have legitimate inputs. And remember, the basis of the legitimacy of democracy is that you're actually representing the will of the people. But if you're only representing, a plurality of a plurality, right? If you're representing, some bare minimum percentage of a low turnout, in terms of the aggregate population that is being represented, it's trivial at some level. And certainly Trump reflects that, and Brexit also reflected that, because you didn't have that high a turnout for Brexit on June 20th or whatever of 2016. And you want to know why? Because it was raining. So
Huh.
Britain has thrown itself off of a cliff. I mean, literally interminable, an abyss, on the basis
Yeah.
of a 50.26 vote result of a not a very high turnout on a rainy day.
On a
Is
rainy
that a
day. Yeah.
smart
That's
is that a
absurd.
smart way to run a formerly great empire? I mean, I think not. So
I think
you've
not
got
at
to
all.
have
Yeah.
100%. You've got to have 100% voter turnout. And you know what? It's the best thing you can do for your educational system, quite frankly. Who the hell needs like MTV Rock the Vote campaigns? I mean, if you really want people to get educated about politics, make them go into the voter booth, because there's nothing more embarrassing as a person, as an individual, than going to vote and not recognizing the names. People will educate themselves if they have to vote. I'm not making this up. This is what happens in
Yeah.
all of the countries where people do have to vote. And so, to
Yeah.
me,
Yeah.
again, it's just like this no-brainer, total no-brainer.
Well, let's get on to technocracy. Is it a neologism? Is it a word that you've coined? Or, well, what is it, and how does it solve some of the problems of democracy?
Sure. I mean, I've coined a bunch of terms like connectography and so on, but I did not coin technocracy. Is a very old term. I mean, old meaning it's somewhere in the early mid 20th century, but it's really a
Right.
19th century French sort of form, if you will, of institutional design. The short version of the story is, after France lost the Franco-Prussian Wars of the 1870s, they realized that they really needed to not be so lazy and to sort of, put some backbone into their government. And they created a whole new kind of architecture to train elites in a meritocratic way, into very rigorous examinations. So technocracy is not a silver bullet solution. Like democracy, it's a way of doing things. It's not the solution itself. It's just
Sure.
part of the package of governance. And here, when you're talking about technocracy, when I'm talking about it, it specifically relates to how do you select people to work in the executive branch, whether it's the president or whether it's the federal service, the civil service, things like that. And it's not only how you select them, but then it's how they operate. So that's what I get into in the book. And then again, America, most of what is great and physically recognizable about America, whether it's the Social Security Administration and the national parks or the national highway system, or a lot of things that we identify as the grand edifice and institutions of America, a lot of these took shape in the same late 19th, early 20th century period, actually, when we are investing a lot in modernizing the bureaucracy of the state and employing lots of people in government and, attracting the best and the brightest and all this kind of thing. So America at its best has been a very technocratic state, and it's obviously come fallen quite a long way from there. And you can identify the period of time. In Britain, it was under Thatcher. In the US, it was under Reagan. When the federal service, the funding for public service and the employment in public service really started to taper off, and the institutions like the Congressional Research Service or others that provide high quality input into governance have been neglected and not getting enough support to cover and research all the issues that they do, have started to taper off. So one of the funny experiences for me in writing this book was sort of starting to Google basically some of my own ideas, like, hey, what if we were to combine the Department of Commerce and the Department of Transportation? Like, that would be a really cool idea, because I've got this section on how to streamline government. And I'm like, oh, someone already came up with that. And then, another idea, I Google it, oh, someone already came up with that. And every time, here's the irony of it all, every single idea that I had already been thought of by a U.S. government agency about the U.S. government, how to fix the U.S. government, and all of it, and none of it was ever done, right? And so, in a technocracy, you've got that independent cadre, you've got that independent set of professionals who are trained to study issues, who are not partisan, who don't have their job on the line if depending on who gets elected, whose job it is to think long term about the welfare of the country, to maximize the public good for as many citizens as possible. That is their job. That is their only job. And let me be frank, America still has hundreds of thousands of people who have that job. The problem is that they are underfunded, demoralized. They are the people that Trump and Steve Bannon have been calling the deep state. When he says deep state, and as if it's a derisive negative term, he's comparing us to places like Russia and Turkey, basically, where there's some conspiratorial element of secret services that are actually pulling the strings, But what he's actually referring to in terms of the human beings that he's calling the deep state, those are the people that are praised in functioning societies, right? Those are the people who you hold up as role models because they're educated, they're hardworking, they've committed their careers to public service, and they do it selflessly. And those are the people I'm talking about. And we have a lot of those people, but I feel very bad for them, the way they've been treated the last decades.
Well, they don't really have a voice. I mean, they are the technocrats. And I guess it's worth saying for listeners that I think what you mean by technocracy is a way of blending democracy, so the will of the people, with the expertise that exists in policy bodies.
So that's why I call it direct technocracy. The model direct in the book that if there's anything original truly in the book, it's this phrasing, direct technocracy. I'm explicitly saying that technocracy alone would not be good. No one wants to live in a country where you don't have a voice and only the experts decide what's good for you, right? That's against our dignity, our fundamental dignity, and our democratic right. So the direct part of the equation is a reference to the direct democracy of Switzerland, where the citizens get to decide everything, and they're extremely active and educated participants, and there's no issue on which citizens don't get to have a say. War, peace, central banking, you name it, the citizens have a say. So I'm obviously a huge believer in that model. I'm a big believer in democracy and every single citizen voting and participating. But I also believe that in a chaotic, complex world where we don't, where you have to make decisions very quickly and you have to juggle the impulses of the people who don't all agree with each other at all, and you have to make decisions out of that jumble of opinions, you do obviously need a sitting or a continuous set of people whose job it is to take all of that information. And again, the point of the book is, of course, not just to focus on democracy in terms of people's inputs, but also data, right? All the data points that we have about what's working, what's not working, what are other countries doing, who are our competitors, what's the shape of the long-term economy, what are the technological shifts, all that data, right? You've got to take the data, you've got to take the democratic inputs, you've got to mix it all together. You've got to figure out the scenarios. You've got to make decisions, and you've got to do it fast. That's the reality of government, right? The reality of government is not just sipping tea and pontificating like Winston, with as if you're, Winston Churchill, like this is not an
Yeah.
idle conversation. This is the real world. And I'm talking about government for the real world has to have the people who are competent to juggle all these issues. So I want to combine the democracy with the technocracy. That's why I call it direct technocracy.
And how does Switzerland get expertise? Because, they have the will of the people, but John Maynard Keynes talked about animal spirits or people or mobs or autocracy or the will of the people sometimes being overly driven by emotion and ideology and fear or whatever, and insufficiently schooled in the issues to make informed choices. How does Switzerland consult people on decisions that have some requirement for expertise in order to render an appropriate opinion? How do they do that?
Right.
Take climate change or take charter schools or something like that.
Sure. Yeah, no, there's a long and a short answer, obviously. I mean, on the one hand, they've been doing it for a long time, so it's well honed. It isn't the exact same form as it used to be. They have lots of initiatives and referenda. The citizens can start petitions and gather enough signatures to make it a legislative issue for parliamentary debate. Or if you gather enough support for an initiative, then it is automatically required to be signed into law, unless there is some grave objection by the Supreme Court or something like that. So you can even have initiatives to have new constitutional amendments or to repeal amendments. For example, on the one hand, sometimes the citizen movements, such as the banning of minarets, for example, this was a very controversial one, conflicts obviously with freedom of speech expression, right? So you can have lots and lots of very complicated situations arise as a result of citizens driving policy, but you work through those case by case, right? You have to revisit them. You have to have a ruling or
Sure.
opinion issued by the court. The parliamentary committees can weigh in. The citizens can then have a revote. You can rephrase the initiative or the referendum. It's
Sure.
a dynamic process, not a linear one. And they've just been practicing it over time. And by the way, they continue to improve it. They're digitizing it, for example, right now. They're getting more adept at combining, let's say 5 different citizens in 5 different cantons, which is their version of states, have a similar sounding initiative at the same time. They force them to get together and to fuse it into a common wording so that it doesn't eat up everyone's time over just simple semantics, right? So they're starting to do this in California too, by the way. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but by the way, all of that is to say that this is our idyllic image of Switzerland, and everyone thinks of Switzerland as a place that works so well because, everyone gathers every 2 weeks and they tie their cow up to the fence, and then they gather in a field and they, discuss the issues and they hold up placards. As much as that is true, B, at the same time, that is not the reason that Switzerland is Switzerland. The reason Switzerland runs like a clock is because it's a very, very, very technocratic country, right? Those hyper-educated PhDs and very, very well-trained professionals in sort of technical disciplines that work for the government, they're the ones who design the dams. They're the ones that invest in the R&D. They are the reason that there wasn't some initiative that said, yes, let's spend 4% of GDP on research and development. Let's offer universal health care to the people. Like this is something where the government has said, we're going to do this, and of course the people support it. If they didn't support it, they could repeal it. But what makes the state work is the state, right? It's not the fact that people gather and have plebiscites. And so what we overlook when we have this rosy image of Swiss democracy, we forget that it is a hyper-technocratic state, absolutely hyper-technocratic. It is a first-class technocracy. Its institutions are incredibly well-funded. They do all of the things that I was saying earlier around using data, building scenarios, modeling their role in the economy, looking at, currency shifts, all these kinds of things. They are incredibly adept, and they inform the government, and the government trusts their judgment, and they make decisions based on that. That's the way it should work.
Yeah, it's quite an amazing little country. And I can't remember the Swiss population.
9 million.
About 9 million. You see, from my point of view as a business strategist, if you think of companies as business entities like corporations, which need a strategy, which need a unique selling proposition, which need branding, which need, to specialize in some respect or another to compete in the global stage. I mean, 9 million, that's probably the population of Michigan I would guess, in the United States. And here we have a country that competes on the world stage, and anything that Switzerland bothers to make, it makes at sort of a world-class level, whether that's watches, whether
Bingo.
that's banking, whether it's funds or something like that. And that's exactly what Jack Welch said when he was running GE. He said, we're going to be number 1 or 2 in all our markets. That's it. We're not going to do anything we suck at, because that would be a stupid way for us to proceed. And so the Swiss are, in a way, and I'm sure you're sympathetic to this, they are strategic planners par excellence as a country. But strategic planning in the United States is a dirty word. So having an industrial strategy for the United States, or even a regional industrial strategy in the United States, is anathema, because how we want our industrial strategy determined in the United States is by market forces, by short-term market pressures. And it's absurd, because the best run countries in the world, they have a strategy for how they're going to compete on the global stage. But because the United States has had such a competitive economic advantage for so long, because of its blessing and, its blessing in natural resources, for a good number of other reasons, it's not had to worry about how it's going to compete in a national stage.
Right.
But I think the day will come when the United States is going to have to think seriously about where it competes, how it competes, what its industrial strategy is, what infrastructure we need to deliver our industrial strategy, what education we need to deliver our industrial strategy. There's going to have to be I just don't think you can exist in the 21st century in a world that's got 220 countries, or however you'd like to count them, or something like that, without thinking longer term than quarterly returns in the stock market, which is more or less how capital is allocated in the United States right now.
We're past the point where we need to be doing that strategy. I think the real question we face now is, are we too late in developing that strategy?
Sure.
And also, you're right about the complacency as a driver of it. We've had enormous advantages, been number 1, been so successful, still dominate a whole bunch of industries without a doubt. So there's been a lot of complacency. There's also been ignorance. So there's a very false ideology to think that America has succeeded purely on the basis of market forces. By now, everyone should hopefully be familiar with this notion of the innovation state, right? The fact is that Silicon Valley is not an accident, right? There's some I write about this in the book. There's this sort of, mythology that, oh, well, we just happen to have Stanford and sunny weather, and therefore, poof, Silicon Valley emerges, right? It's like, hello, have you ever heard of, Department of Defense? There's been so much government funding and support for some of the key innovative entities, Manhattan Project style stuff, that has actually been the driver of American innovation. So you can't actually pretend that it's purely a market exercise. So we have obviously, since the financial crisis with the bailouts, had to face up to the fact that we're not truly, a free market economy. And that's not a bad thing to admit. It's just there is no such thing in the real world as that kind of a place. Only in textbooks is there such a place. And that's not really a strategic advantage. But in any case, the fact is that everyone else is doing this. No one is going to shift back to quote unquote, free market interactions. Therefore, we have to get in that game and have an industrial policy the way other countries do. Otherwise, they're going to eat our lunch. So again, they already are eating our lunch. They've already eaten our lunch. If they hadn't eaten our lunch, we wouldn't have Donald Trump.
Well, they pick off industries one by one. I mean, China is now picking off green tech, solar tech, if you want. So, I think what you say is remarkable. There's this fantasy that Silicon Valley is an example of the free market at its best. And the reason that Silicon Valley is so successful is because of American entrepreneurial spirit. They don't know how heavy-handed the U.S. government was in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, investing in infrastructure, investing in partnerships with Stanford, investing in public-private partnerships that built the infrastructure and the ecosystem which we're prospering today. And I don't think Americans are aware that one of the reasons America was so successful in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, of course, was the heavy-handed state investment in infrastructure in the 1950s post-war, because we were scared the Russians were going to beat us and everything. They were going to eat our lunch. And so we are benefiting. And again, we have a following wind because of the huge investment in education and infrastructure in the 1950s. I think America takes that for granted very much at their peril in today's world.
Again, the only question is it too late? And I hope that it's not. In some areas, it's not. In others, I feel like it is. If you just take our immigration policy, it's death by 1,000 cuts. I mean, we don't get 100% of the best and the brightest the way we used to, right? We get, let's say, 50%, and the other 50% are going to Canada and England and Germany and Australia and wherever else. Our best universities are exporting themselves and setting up campuses around the world in order to take
Sure.
advantage of talent because of our immigration policy. So that's just one of many examples where there's much more intelligent solutions around how to do immigration policy. In fact, if we just rewind a bit to when you asked me, what are the top issues that we need to be more technocratic about? We talked about infrastructure and healthcare. God knows immigration and climate policy are just as high on the list. So, there are ways to please all sides and to do so in a way that again, sometimes to create compromise, you have to engineer it. You have to draft the middle of the road proposal, that actually makes sense and is actually going to be politically feasible, but also makes most sense for the country. And it's not going to emerge from these polarizing debates about putting up a wall on the Mexican border, right?
Sure. But I think that affects immigrants emotionally. I mean, if you're a Middle Eastern physicist, or if you're an Indian top class microelectronics engineer, for example, and you have a choice, so you have people bidding for your talent on a global scale, the hostile environment to non-white people or to immigrants in the United States, there's certainly the best in the world are factoring that emotionally, if not rationally, into their calculations about where they want to spend their career and the rest of your lives. I mean, your parents are immigrants and so are mine, because America offered itself as a beacon of hope and a beacon of opportunity and a place that welcomed people from different backgrounds. And as soon we're talking about stuff that'll have a defect over 25 or 50 years, is that as soon as you lose that brand of being a place where anyone can make something of themselves irrespective of their background, come one, come all, I think that's going to be incredibly costly. And of course, very, very, very difficult to measure as well. But you think they'll lose the war for talent because of this rhetoric on immigration? Certainly at some stage.
Again, immigration policy also has shifted, back and forth. It's vacillated wildly. We've obviously been the most significant immigrant nation in the history of the world. So it's difficult to erode that. We still have so many new migrants coming every single year at all levels of the economic ladder and from all walks of life and all over the world. But what countries do that want to make sure that immigrants are not just starting Silicon Valley tech companies, which they're doing a great job at doing. And we should remember that is the most productive, dynamic, and profitable sector of the economy. It's no joke. But on top of that, if you want to welcome them into sector by sector where there are shortages, where technology still has a shortage, there's a shortage in healthcare, shortages in education, shortages in agriculture. There's lots of sectors of the economy where we actually have labor shortages based upon a mismatch of demographics, geography, skill sets, training. You can actually have a much more, again, technocratic approach. You can say, let's devise a system, points-based system. Canada has this, the UK has this, so many countries have this. Let's figure out a point system based on people's skills. Let's dynamically calculate which states in America, need which people for which jobs, what sectors at what levels. And let's start to, prioritize and fast track immigrants for those areas. This is not rocket. We do things that are way more complicated than what I just described in this world. I mean,
indeed.
My daughter's third grade class could devise this system, for God's sake. So we can do this, and then of course, then immigrants go where immigrants are needed. Right. And then, people who feel they don't need or don't want them, I mean, they don't have to interact with them. Right. So absolutely. I think everyone can be happy.
Indeed. Well, you've been very generous with your time. I have two more questions, but let me see if we can combine them into one. In the last section of the book, you redesigned U.S. democracy. So let's imagine that President Trump invited you in and said, we'd like you to run a project, Professor Khanna, to redesign our democratic institutions and the way U.S. democracy works. Will you lead it? What are your ideas? And then my second question are, what are the chances that it might happen? Because power doesn't concede itself gracefully. So you have a template and you have an image in the back of the book, which is your idea about how things might work differently. So why don't, if it's not too hard to describe the image, why don't you describe that for listeners and then say, what you see is the positive or negative forces against perhaps having something like that realized while we're still young enough to enjoy it?
Right. First of all, you can feel free to take that org chart the colorful redesign of the federal government that I have in the book and put it on the website. I encourage everyone to look at it, look at all of the ramifications of it and all the specific institutional designs that are in there. Secondly, the chances are zero of it happening anyway in the present context, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't fight the good fight. And then, to really get into the meat of it, there's obviously some pretty radical ideas in there. For example, I say we need a collective presidency, right? We should literally not have one oak desk in the Oval Office with one man or woman sitting behind it. That's actually not the right way to make executive, world historical, strategic decisions at this point in time.
You should have seven cubicles. Is that 7 cubicles? Is that right? I can't remember.
Yeah, exactly. So open plan, 7 cubicles is my model. I say 7 presidents is better than one. Again, that comes from the Swiss example where you have a federal executive council of 7 members. They rotate each year, with one being kind of, the sort of first among equals for the year, because you just need to have one person get on the plane to go to a summit, not 7. But generally speaking, they act very collegially. They represent 4 different political parties, so you're bringing together very diverse opinions and expertise and backgrounds, and they deliberate together. And that's the way it should be. We don't need people shooting from the hip in our country, and we don't need that in an age where big strategic decisions can have major consequences. So again, are we going to get there? No, but is that our loss in not having a better system? Yes, it is. So I urge everyone who says, oh, that'll never happen, to after you say, oh, that'll never happen, say to yourself also, oh, that's too bad, because we're the losers from not having a better system, because the better system is out there and we can and should do it. Then one of the other more controversial ideas is to abolish the Senate. Again, one of these ideas where I was like, oh my God, let me Google this. I wonder what people, if anyone's ever, sure enough, there's like an avalanche of writing about the degeneration. There we go with that word again.
Yeah.
How the Senate used to be such a more credible body, but and the time at which it was more functional and played a role as something more than just a smaller version of the House of Representatives in terms of leadership was the time when most senators were former governors. And that's actually what was my idea was to replace the Senate with what I call an assembly of governors. So again, I didn't even know that was true in terms of, you have to go back at historical records and look at exactly which senators had what backgrounds and so on. But suffice it to say that today, most senators are former congressmen. And so it literally is just a smaller, better paid version of the House. Whereas if you had governors, and I figure, so why go back to you? The only way to go back to having more senators be governors is to just ditch the Senate entirely and replace it with governors. And governors, interestingly enough, have alongside mayors, have the highest approval rating in terms of public officials in the United States. Their high satisfaction rating. They work very well together, which is kind of ironic because they govern actually distinct geographies. But the National Governors Association is a very effective body, unlike the catastrophically ineffective Congress that we have. So I'm a big believer, and again, this is not just an accidental idea. It stems from one of the most important theses in the book, which is that we have too much representation and not enough administration. And the difference between a governor and a senator is that a governor actually has to govern. He actually has to do things. He actually has to know how to manage a budget. Whereas a senator, his job is to, quote unquote, represent, right? And it's never clear who he's actually representing. Is it his personal view? Is it his special interest? Is it the lobbyists? Is it, God forbid, your own citizens and constituents? And he doesn't necessarily have the explicit mandate to get along with, the others. Whereas governors, you find when they get together, they're desperate to work together because they know that, if their success hinged only on what happens within their state borders, they'd be screwed. So they are the number one advocates for national infrastructure renewal or even regional. They want to collaborate so much. So I'm a huge fan of the governors. And again, so all of this was like my sort of instinct. And the more I started researching, I was like, oh my God, this is totally the right idea. We need to scrap the Senate entirely and replace it with the Assembly of Governors. And then I obviously in the book, I go into more detail about how it would operate, what would the governors do, how you would split up. You'd have 2 governors per state and where they would work and sit and how the dynamic would be. So I'm fairly specific about what I think it should look like and how it would work. And I think it would be a far sight better than what we've got right now.
Interesting. Yeah, so it's a council of governors, if you will. It's the 50 states having a governor, someone who has been a governor, or the current governors who are the voting legislative body.
Each state would literally have 2 governors instead of 1. And then I go into, would you select it by having the number 1 and 2 winners in the race, or would they run as 2 on a ticket? And then once you have this team, one would serve in the state capital, the other would serve in Washington. They could rotate. So one is kind of administering the state in the state, and the other is representing the state in the capital, meaning Washington.
Sure. And so on. And your logic is these guys are used to producing results. So they're administrators. They know how to run a budget. They know how to run a state. They know how to run a school system. They know how to run, a state with its infrastructure development and its manufacturing or service economies. So they're people that have hands-on experience. And I guess governors are very close to the needs and wants of the people too. So without direct democracy, they're the people who ought to at least have their finger much closer to the pulse on what citizens actually need from their government. I think that's part of your idea.
Yeah, they have the competence, they have the competence that is absolutely essential, right? The competencies, especially experience in doing a budget and again, actually administering. So I think, those are not incidental skill sets. I mean, they're really, really important in order to actually be successful.
Yeah, very good. Well, look, you've been super generous. We're 45 minutes in here, which has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed that. For people who are listening, I'm going to give away 3 copies of Technocracy. I'm going to tell you how to get one of those free copies in a minute. But I think all of us can be very grateful to Parag for spending this time. It's now almost 10 o'clock p.m. in Berlin on a Friday night. And Parag has given very generously of his time to spend this with us. So I want to thank you personally and on behalf of everybody who's listening. Thanks, Parag.
It was a great chat. Thank you so much, Paul.
And now comes one of my favorite parts of the show, and I get to talk about great books, movies, videos, and even other podcasts. For that, I got some great news. I've booked a former editor of The Economist magazine, the highest quality news magazine in the world, and a must-read for top CEOs and policymakers. Anthony Gottlieb is going to be with us in March to talk about his book, The Dream of Enlightenment, about the Enlightenment. Very excited about that. Hot on his heels will be Harvard's Steven Pinker to talk about his new book on the same subject. In addition, we're going to have a voice from the far right coming soon. Cato Institute's Johan Norberg will be with us to discuss his book, Progress. If you've ever had the feeling that humanity is going to hell in a handcart, Johan's book takes the opposite perspective, describing, factually, how much progress we've made in poverty, health, environment, crime, justice, and more over the last few hundred years. There are links to both Anthony's book, Dream of Enlightenment, and Johan's book, Progress, in the show notes. Next week, we have a special guest, Linda Elder, who spent her whole career exploring critical thinking, what it means to think critically, why we don't do it, yet we think we do, and tools you can make use of to sort the wheat from the chaff in your own thinking and in our noisy world. To celebrate the launch of the show, and to thank you all for listening, I'm going to be giving away books, lots and lots of books. All you have to do is leave a review in iTunes. We're going to raffle off a book every single week for 12 weeks. So head on over to paulgibbons.net/iTunes to get easy to follow directions and let me know the title of your review to make sure that you're entered to win. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Think Bigger, Think Better. Great ideas are great, but this isn't gospel. Share your critical thinking in the comments. Where do I disagree? What insights were most powerful? If you got value, don't forget to share the value by sharing the podcast. Finally, to get information on book and blog releases and new video content, head over to paulgibbons.net and join the community of thinkers talking about using science and philosophy to make our world a better place.